I am Patricia Ann Simpson, and I am recording this oral history for the Atomic Heritage Foundation on May 3rd, 2017, in Studio B of the Visual Communications Building at Montana State University, Bozeman, Montana. Please say your name and spell it.
Oh, my name is Al Zelver. It's spelled Z as in zebra, E-L, V Victoria, E-R.
Please tell us your date and place of birth.
Well, my date was July 2nd, 1920, and I was born in Stockton, California. And
where did you grow up?
well, I grew up 14 miles from Stockton in Lodi, California. It's in the Central Valley of California. My mother just went to Stockton to give birth, and then we went back home.
Can you tell us a little bit about your education? What kind of an education?
Well, I went to public schools in Lodi, and then after that I went to Stanford for 4 years and got an AB in English. And then in the military I was sent to University of Michigan. Well, I was sent back to Stanford to take Japanese 101 and then to University of Michigan to study Japanese.
This section of questions has to do with how you became involved in World War II. So how did you first join the Army, and how did you become an Army intelligence officer?
Well, the first was easy. It was really, the Selective Service Act had been passed before, and the only people who were exempt for religious purposes. It's an interesting question because sexual orientation did not exempt you, and still I don't think does, except by Army regulations. But there were none. I served with a lot of gays, and so did everybody I knew. And it was easy to make the choice. It was just a question of deciding what service you wanted to be in. If you enlisted, you could get a choice of services, where if you waited to be drafted, why you wouldn't necessarily.
And how did you become an intelligence officer?
Well, shortly before I think it was a day or two before I enlisted, a friend of mine, a classmate at school, phoned and said, "How would you like to be a Japanese language officer in the intelligence?" I said, "Well, that sounds pretty good. What do I do?" He says, "Well, you phone the St. Francis Hotel and ask for Major Gould." And he said, and he learned it from another classmate of ours who had already seen him. And it wasn't a storefront recruiting office. It was a suite in the St. Francis. And he said he's interviewing people to see if they qualify to be Japanese language officers. And so I phoned Major Gould and made an appointment and went to see him. And was interviewed and was selected then.
Was there anything special about your background or abilities or education that made you a good candidate?
Well, I had studied, he wanted to know if I knew Japanese, and of course I didn't. And he had a Japanese-American surgeon with him who would have given me a test if I knew any. But I'd studied 4 languages. I didn't say that I knew 4 languages. I said I'd studied 4 languages. Actually, I could speak ungrammatical German, but the others, one was Hebrew, one was French, one was German, and one was Latin. And he said, so I seemed to be somebody into languages. And he said, "Well, you qualify in every way." And I had a college degree, which I just had. And he said, "Well, you qualify in every way," he said, "except for one thing." He says, "You don't know a word of Japanese." He says, "But we'll fix that." He says, "You go back to Stanford. We'll send you to Stanford. Well, you can enlist. We'll send you to Stanford for take Japanese 101, and you come back in 3 months, and I'll be here. And then the sergeant will give you a test, and if you pass that, then we'll admit you to the language school. And if you pass that, then we'll send you to infantry basic. And if you pass that, then we'll send you to Fort Snelling for advanced." So it was going to take it took about half the war.
So when you were deployed to the China-Burma-India Theater, where were you stationed?
Well, excuse me. Well, I was sent, first we landed in Calcutta. And that was actually the first time we were put in harm's way crossing the Pacific and unescorted, not in a convoy and with no escort. And so we had to wear life preservers 24/7 and landed in Calcutta and then we're trucked to Camp Conchapara. That was the first place I was stationed, and that was just a deployment center to decide. And then from there, they would send you someplace else for duty in the China-Burma-India Theater. And you were free most of the day. You could do whatever you wanted to do. And you just had lectures from the lieutenant colonel who said, roll your sleeves down, slather yourself with insect repellent, he says, no Purple Hearts for malaria, and don't eat any food except the army mess, he says. Or you'll have dysentery, and there are no Purple Hearts, he said, for diarrhea. And from there, I then went to, deployed to New Delhi. I was on this detached duty with the British, and there, Colonel Musgrove told me if you're going to serve with us, he says, Lieutenant, I was now a lieutenant, you better look like us. So the British have much nicer uniforms than we do anyway. and then, but there was really no duty there because the Burma Theater, the Burma campaign had just terminated. And I was there serving. The British were a very jolly lot, but they were just terrible in India. It was like passage to India, and I was really glad to leave. And then was ordered to an airfield in Chabwa in eastern India. And while I was there, the assimilated captain for the Office of War Information heard there was somebody in camp who knew Japanese, and he'd had 3 Japanese prisoners who had working for the Office of War Information, helping them edit propaganda leaflets. And since the campaign was over, he wanted to get rid of them. He didn't know what to do. They were being the Office of War Information was being deactivated. And so he came to me and he said, well, you're the good angel. You're going to take them off my hands and escort them. You'll have them in your custody and escort them to Kunming. And just before the flight left, a couple of days later, it was foggy. I thought that we're not going to fly out of that overcast. And the pilot said, he says, if we can see the end of the runway, he says, we take off. And there were 3 prisoners then when the OWI came and sitting in the seat. One of them was carrying a box, and I either lacked common sense or training. They weren't restrained, and I didn't have a weapon. And they had been, cooperative prisoners. And I didn't think to ask him what was in the box. And we got aboard, and one was a captain, the other 2 were sergeants. The sergeant went to the end of the plane and was reading a book, which turned out to be the New Testament. And the sergeant on my left didn't have much to say, but the captain was quite a talkative chatterbox. He told me that the man on my right with the box was a baker in Osaka, and the other one at the end had been an executioner. And he was reading the Bible, apparently easier to find redemption in Christianity than it was in Shinto. And I never saw him again. I never saw the 2 sergeants, but I did meet the captain later, which we can talk about if you want to, later on in Tokyo on the street, which is a big surprise. So from Kunming, I was in Kunming when the war ended.
Okay.
But when the war ended, then I was sent to Shanghai, and then from Shanghai I was then sent to Tokyo.
Would you tell us a little bit about your sense of how prisoners of war were treated?
Well, I'd never heard of torture or hurt. If I'd heard of waterboarding, I would have thought it's being pulled on a speedboat behind a plank, standing on a plank. And the only lecture we heard at Fort Snelling about treatment of prisoners was an afternoon talking about the Geneva Conferences. And when I met my 3 prisoners, I thought, well, there's no reason for me not to be courteous. And there's every reason for them to be courteous because I could give them favors with chewing gum and chocolate bars. And they were courteous. And we each used the polite endings in Japanese when we spoke. There was the only memorandum I ever saw was one from the lead negotiator, interrogator, which is a Colonel Moran. He was in the Marines. And he said, you treat the prisoner with dignity. And he says, and he would sit knee to knee to prisoners while campaigns were going on and get them to give information. The Japanese were very cooperative. They were not because, first of all, they weren't supposed to surrender. They thought they disgraced and would be executed if they ever went back to their units. They thought they were told they were going to be tortured by us, and then when they found they weren't. And so by and large, now there were some rogue interrogators to be sure, but I never saw or heard of any. And most of the interrogation that I knew about was done by Japanese Americans. They didn't really need, the Army makes a lot of mistakes, and one was that the assumption was that they couldn't use Japanese Americans without supervision from an American officer who knew Japanese. Well, that's why I was trained. And catch-22 was there were no American officers who knew Japanese, so they had to select people and send them back to school. A friend of mine whose Japanese was better than mine was interrogating a prisoner in Burma, and the prisoner said, he says, "Why do you talk like a girl?" And there was a Japanese American near, and they're called Nisei. I mean, we come second generation Japanese, and we had 6,000 of them who finally were in service, and the sergeant said, he says, "He's not trying to be a smart-ass, Lieutenant." He says, "He's just appalled that you're using the polite endings with him when his own officers wouldn't, you know."
Did you come into contact with any people who were later known to be spies?
No. And there was one, I didn't, well, I was not in covert operations. I mean, just being a language, my MOS, it's military specialty, occupational specialty, is 9300, which means that your job is to interrogate, translate, or interpret, or be, supervise a Japanese American who would, and they didn't need any supervision. There was only one famous Japanese spy, and he wasn't an American. He was a Japanese naval officer on duty. Who was assigned to the embassy and not embassy. I mean the consulate in Hawaii. But it was hard for the Japanese to be spies, But there were spies, but I didn't have any contact with any of them.
What role did patriotism and wanting to win the war for the United States and its allies play in motivating you and your colleagues?
Well, that was never discussed by anybody. I mean, it was just assumed. The Japanese couldn't have done a better recruiting job than the military ever could. I mean, when you heard about Pearl Harbor, I mean, a friend of mine came down and said, who was living in an apartment above, and said, "Something very serious has happened, Al." He says, "The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." Well, it may have been more serious than he realized, but I knew we'd all be involved. World War II had been going on for a while now. And so if you didn't draft, and all my friends enlisted because you could become an officer if you enlisted and you had a college degree. And you just never discussed patriotism. Nobody wore little flags here the way they do now. Nobody had to prove it.
What do you remember about the state of the war in August of 1945?
Well, in August 1925, 45. I mean, the decision had already been made these are from documents that I researched, and they're the original documents, not what somebody wrote about the war, but what they were. And you can find many of them online in the Truman's Library. And the decision to use an atomic bomb had been made by August, but it couldn't be made until July 16th, when the Trinity test was the code name for the first atomic bomb was detonated, and then they knew they had one. And 9 days later, in the diary entry from President Truman, he said, "I'm instructing the Secretary of War to drop an atom bomb." He says that they will be given notice. They weren't given notice, and we will give them an opportunity to surrender first, and which they did, but not until after he made the decision to drop the bomb. And theoretically, the decision could have been rescinded, but he says, "I don't think they will. They will take the opportunity to surrender." And there's this top secret order from General Handy, the acting chief of staff, to the head of to General Spots, to drop the atomic bomb on August 3rd, after August 3rd, weather permitting, at the earliest possible time. And the only target that was indicated, well, there was one, whether to drop it on Niigata, and Niigata was a departure port on the East Coast, but no Japanese by this time. They had lost the war months before, so they weren't departing. So there's no point in really bombing. And the Kokoda Arsenal, which was a big naval arsenal, that was the only military target that was really indicated of the three. Yeah, there was Hiroshima, which was selected because of the size, and it was also, it hadn't been a very good target because for incendiary bombing. So it was still, they were running, they'd bombed and really almost obliterated about over 60 cities with fire bombings for the most part. So there were not a lot of cities that were left to be able to bomb, to try an atomic bomb and see what one would really do. So Hiroshima was picked for that reason. And the reason it wasn't good for incendiary bombings, it has 5 river strands. So if you dropped a bomb, the fire wouldn't spread across the river. So that was going on in August.
Did you, in August of 1945, did you have any of this knowledge? What was your own awareness at the time?
No, the Manhattan Project was the code name for the building of the atomic bomb. And it was called that because it was a Corps of Engineer project. And they always named the project after the first headquarters. And the first headquarters was Manhattan. And otherwise it made no sense. But they moved it to Los Alamos, then. But there were 23 different sites and about over 100,000 people, and 2 whole cities were built. And but nobody knew about it. It was the best kept secret in the military. Even Vice President Truman, he wasn't in the loop to know about it until he was sworn in as president. But one person who did know about it was Stalin, and he had 10 molds, and one was well known afterwards, Klaus Fuchs. But other than that, we had no inkling. And commanders in the field didn't know about it either. So they just went around planning campaigns and incurring casualties, even though the war was about to end. If you wanted to, I could talk to you about the events leading up to that top secret order.
Exactly the next question. So when did you first hear of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And how did you and your fellow soldiers react?
Well, we were obviously ecstatic to have the war ended. And all we knew was that some big bomb had been dropped. And we didn't know on where or what all we cared about is that the war ended. And I thought it saved my life because a couple of weeks before, Major Jorgensen asked me to come to his office and said, "How would you like to volunteer for a mission, Lieutenant? And that means you're going to be." So I said, "Do I have a choice, sir?" And he said, "No." So I said, "I volunteer." Well, the mission was really one that, like a lot of them, I was really not trained for, qualified for, or experienced for. But that's not abnormal in the military. And it was to be dropped with 2 Japanese American sergeants and 2 Chinese American sergeants on the other side of the Japanese lines. They had a corridor that ran through where it would be dropped, and it was part of Operation Carbonado, which was to take back some ports on the East Coast, and so these major operations were still going on. It was not a very good. And Major Jorgensen said, he says, "Write your family that they won't hear from me for a long time, and you'll be on diem." And I won't bore you with the mission that was going on. Also being dropped inside. It wasn't unusual to be dropped without jump training, and it wasn't normal, but not unusual or unheard of. So it wasn't a mission, and I thought that was not a good place to be wearing an American uniform. And so I thought that it was a good chance that it had saved my life from that mission.
Do you remember how you felt when you heard about Japan's surrender?
Well, I felt that my life had been saved, and the emperor on August 15th then broadcast Japan's surrender. He didn't use the word surrender. He just said, "We have accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration," which was an offer of them to surrender. He says, because the war has not, quote, the understatement of this century is, he says, the war has not necessarily gone to Japan's advantage. it really was a speech he gave telling the Japanese, to get on rebuilding and not to be, in a sense, to be bitter. It could have been written by a speechwriter for the Allies, actually. I don't know how much influence it had. It was a kind of in archaic Japanese, which a lot of Japanese, and some people who, it was at noon in the day and the Japanese were alerted to it, all were listening, but a lot of people couldn't understand it because it was in archaic court Japanese. Some people thought he was broadcasting a victory. I mean, I'm going to try to distinguish between what is a rumor and what I've heard and what I know. The only things we really know for facts are these documents and my own experience, which I put in a journal. But everything else, but the hearsay and rumor is really part of the war, so I think it's worth recording.
Were you made aware of any of the health risks involved after arriving in Japan? Were you told about radiation?
No, and in fact, the people who were in charge of dropping the bomb, they knew that there was radiation, and they thought that the soil would be contaminated, that Hiroshima would be contaminated as Chernobyl has been, but they didn't think the people would be, and not in a significant way, that there would be really radiation sickness, which has counted for many, many deaths. And General Leslie Groves was the engineering officer in charge of the production of the bombs. He wasn't in charge of the scientific development of them. That was physicist Robert Oppenheimer. But Groves testified before Congress, and he was asked whether there was an antidote for radiation sickness, and he said, "Well, I'm not a doctor, but I'll answer that anyway, because I've talked to doctors about it." And they say that it's a very pleasant way to die. And he wasn't very well informed. Can I talk just a minute about General Groves? I'm not sure there'd be an atomic bomb without General Groves having been selected. He had just been in charge of developing the Pentagon, which is not an easy job, and he developed it, within budget and ahead of time. So they thought, this is the man to put in charge of developing the atomic bomb, because there are going to be 2 towns built, 23 sites, a lot of coordination. And he was put in charge. And a major general who was under him wrote in his memoir, he said, "General Groves was the world's worst son of a bitch, bar none." He said, "But if you had to have somebody in charge of developing an atom bomb, I'd choose him." He was really the Steve Jobs of the atomic bomb. And he said, like Jobs, he'd say, if somebody said it'll take a week, he'd say, "I want it done tomorrow." He went and he rescinded orders, he didn't pay, but he was very smart.
Can you tell us a little bit about your first impressions of Hiroshima after the bombing? Were you actually there?
Well, we went to Shanghai first, and everybody in Shanghai who was wearing an American uniform was a hero, because and people stopped you to thank you for liberating Shanghai. After a while, you could get a big head thinking you'd really had something to do with it. Then from Shanghai, the flight plan going from Shanghai to Tokyo passed directly over Hiroshima. And so the pilot flew very low, and he circled in both directions, and he tipped circling, he tipped the wings so each of us could get a good look on both sides of the plane. And none of us we'd all been in China, in the China offensive, but nobody had seen anything like this. And we didn't say much for the rest of the trip. It was really kind of nothing but it. And I thought, well, if you've seen one bombed out city, you've seen them all. But that's not true. The rubble of Berlin, Berlin looks different with rubble. And when I got to Tokyo, it looked very different from Hiroshima and Tokyo. The cities were just the blocks and blocks of ashes. And in the central area, all the buildings were still standing. But in Tokyo, in Hiroshima, big reinforced concrete buildings were tipped over on their sides. All the windows were blown out. Everybody inside it, of course, had been obliterated. And that wasn't true. I don't know whether or not central Tokyo was left as it was, because there was the Imperial Hotel where generals could stay. And at any rate, I was stationed there. The Emperor's Palace was all intact. The headquarters was in the Daiichi building, a big building down the street.
Could you explain the term hibakusha?
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 Oh, that means a bomb victim. And he means receive, and baku means bomb, and sha means person. So it was a person who received a bomb. I didn't meet any hibakusha until years later, and I didn't know that there were any. The last thing I would have thought of her was there was a girl down below in the hospital when I flew over Hiroshima, whom I would meet years later in I think 2008, when she was on a tour, and we could talk about that if you want to at some point.
How did the hibakusha perceive you as an American?
Oh, if you speak Japanese, I don't know how other Americans are received by Japanese because I'm not another American. But if you speak Japanese, they're very cordial. I mean, the first thing they'll say is oh, you speak Japanese so skillfully, and then you'll go on from there, even if you don't. I know when I was assigned to a billet in Tokyo, it was I've forgotten how many stories, but my room I was assigned to was on the 7th floor. And the elevator girl was Japanese, and she said, "What floor, please?" And I said, "Nanakai." And she says, "Oh, you speak Japanese so skillfully, so you don't have to say much."
Would you tell us something about your conversations with survivors?
Well, the survivor, I've only met 2 survivors. Both of them I met in Montana years later. The first one was that girl who was on the floor. Her name is Shigeko Sasamori, and she's quite a celebrity among hibakusha, and you can find about a half a dozen websites with her, and she's also on YouTube. And she's traveled all over giving talks, giving about her experience, and she, of course, is opposed to not only atomic bombs and war, but also even the use of atomic energy. And her experience was that she was some distance from the detonation from ground zero, but she received a dose of radiation, and she was dressing for school. The bomb was dropped at 8:15, and she was dressed from the waist down, but not from the waist up. So she received the radiation on her waist up, particularly her face. And this is her story now, and what she told. It swelled up like a balloon, and she said her mother didn't recognize her, and she was going to be so disfigured that she would never be a bride. And Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Review of Literature, organized a group of Americans to raise the money to bring 24 Hiroshima maidens to the United States for plastic surgery. And she was one of the 24. That was just a token of the number of people who might have been helped, but at least it was helping somebody. And her face, when I saw her face was, it obviously had been restored enough so that she looks okay, but scarred. And she came with the chairman of the Hiroshima Peace Foundation to Bozeman, where I live in Montana, as a tour to raise 3 million signatures to present to President Truman to try to do something about not spreading atomic bombs, but try to reduce them. And she was just so. Steve Leeper, the chairman of the board, gave a talk saying it was as easy as, if there were the political will, compared to climate warming, was the easiest problem to solve, but there's not the political will. And then he asked, she was standing at the back of the room, so I went up to her and said, because I knew obviously from her face that she'd been in Hiroshima, and I said, I said, you and I are probably the only ones in this room, at least in Montana, who probably went to Hiroshima in 1945. And Steve Leeper was standing next to her, and he said, "Were you in Hiroshima in 1940?" I said, "Well, I flew over. And if you were in the occupation," he said, "I want you to come to give a talk in Hiroshima," which I then did later. And her story was, she was restored enough after a whole series of plastic surgery operations. And she said she was so impressed with the kindness that she received living with an American family, she decided to stay in the United States, become a nurse, and help other people, and talk about, the atomic bomb and her experience. And she lives in Santa Monica, California, and she married and has a son who's an attorney. So, it has a relatively happy ending. And incidentally, I didn't need to speak Japanese to her. I mean, her English is fine.
How long did you stay in occupied Japan?
A little over a year. Well, I guess it was over a year. I arrived shortly after the surrender and left in December of '46.
Are there memories from that time that you'd like to
Oh, lots and
share?
lots of memories. Yeah, I kept a journal, and I was a first signed my. If you're a language officer, very often you're kind of left alone, because if there's no interrogating, translating, or interpreting to do, and an officer is really a number of pay grades above you are very respectful because you can do something they can't do. You can help them walk through a wall. You can help them, if they have a girlfriend, you can help them talk to the girlfriend. And so the first duty I was assigned was to monitor broadcasts at the NHK studios. That's like the BBC. It was down the street from where I was stationed. And I want to just stop for a moment to say I would pass the Daiichi building, which is the headquarters from Montana, from headquarters for the Supreme Command of the Allied powers, and General MacArthur, who is not known to be modest, would arrive every day at a set hour. It's 10 o'clock, and there were a lot of Japanese who were Japanese groupies who just wanted to have a glimpse of their new American Idol. And there were no armed guards around. There was no restraining line. He would get out of the car, salute a sergeant, go in, and then they would all turn and bow to the Emperor's palace. Well, as the weeks went by, fewer and fewer of them bowed. And then by spring, only a few old women were bowing. So I thought, well, if he was supposed to, as we'd been told, supposed to be a deity, a god, he couldn't have been much of a god. It's turned out he's not regarded. He's really wasn't regarded as a god at all, and that was just a myth perpetuated. I suppose it was believed by the people in the Office of War Information because they didn't know any better. But then I went on to the NHK studios and introduced myself, and so they gave me a studio to watch in where I could watch the broadcast. And I wasn't told what to censor. There were actually or to listen for. There were actually about 30 things they weren't supposed to talk about. What was coming up as a Cold War. They weren't supposed to talk about treatment of American prisoners, and there were a number of things. One of the things they weren't supposed to talk about is the fact that there was censorship, even though it was forbidden in the new Constitution. And I hadn't been in Japan long enough to understand normal speech. All our teachers would sort of dumb their Japanese down to speak as though you're speaking to a baby, But people don't speak in words, they speak in word clusters. And each cluster sounds like a word. And so I couldn't understand any of the broadcasts, but I thought, well, it's better to remain silent and thought I can understand than to speak. And so I stayed there. The only broadcast I really remember was two men who would come, musicians, to play a concert. And they came in three-piece business suits, and one was carrying a stringed instrument, I think it's shamisen, I think it is, shakuhachi. It was a flute that you blow into, like blowing into a bottle. But before they gave their concerts to a radio audience, which was unseen, they went to another room and dressed in kimono. And then then they sat on cushions on the floor, because that's the way they gave public concerts. Yeah. Well, the other duty I had in Tokyo was to be a foreign correspondent. Came to our headquarters one time, and he needed an interpreter to help his driver. The army had given him a driver and a car to find a man he wanted to interview, and but the driver could speak Japanese, so I was to try to find our way around Tokyo. There were no maps, and most of the city were ashes, but there were some buildings that were still, most of the buildings still standing, or many of them were directly north of the Emperor's Palace, because the B-29s were told not to bomb the palace. Actually, I think one or two did drop there, but they weren't incendiary bombs, I guess, because they didn't do much damage. And then the houses were still standing. Well, anyway, it took a while to find a place to where houses were. And the first house we stopped at, no, there are no street signs in Japan. There still aren't in many places. And the house numbers are not numbered consecutively, and odd and even on one side of the street. The houses were numbered in the order in which they were built. So it doesn't make it easy to find your way around. And so the first lady who came to the house said, I said, can you tell me the name of the street we're on? And she says, she didn't know. I said, how long you've lived here? And she says, 30 years. I said, you've lived here 30 years and you don't know the name of the street? Then she was kind of cross with my rude question, and she said, well, we'll know in a minute. I'll call the master. And he gave us some directions, and then we did find the house. The man that the foreign correspondent was going to interview was Reginald Blythe. And Reginald Blythe was an Englishman who came to Japan some years before. He taught English to the Japanese. He fell in love with Japan, and he fell in love with a Japanese woman, Ben, and his English wife. And she had connections with the imperial family. They weren't close connections, but they were connections. And because he was an enemy alien, he was subject to house arrest, but he wasn't in prison. And it was a very nice house. It looked like a college professor's. And he came in the room and he was interviewed, and he said he wanted to do everything he could to help preserve Japanese culture. And I just sat in the corner like a fly on the wall while the interview was going on. And he said, since you Americans have come, and he gave me a look that wasn't too friendly. He said, all they want to do is, drink Coca-Cola and eat chocolate bars. He says, they're different from you. He says, you look at a mountain and you see the mountain. He says, they look at a mountain and they see a crevice with flowers growing in it. And he and an officer in the Supreme Headquarters Command were instrumental in finding out what MacArthur wanted of the emperor. And the emperor, from that point on, began to act kind of like an English king. He put on a three-piece suit, and he walked among his people, and he toured, farms and mines and so forth. He visited every prefecture. Prefectures are like states or provinces, except one, which was Okinawa. And he would walk among the people and tip his hat, and he would just say, ah, so. And ah, so means the same in Japanese as it does is in English, as a matter of fact. And he became sort of, not a figure of fun, but he was called ah, so-san. And there's a picture of him with an old woman standing next to him, and she's looking around, trying to find the emperor that she knew was supposed to be coming. And she's standing near him because she doesn't expect him to look like this. Normally he'd be, in a uniform with blazing medals and a hat with a plume, and atop of his horse, white snow. And so here was a completely different emperor. He changed his whole image.
How do you feel about the decision to drop the bomb on Japan, and how has your personal experience influenced your feelings about that?
Well, I'm sure that this would be debated and disagreed with by many people, in fact, by most people. But in my view, it was a war crime for a number of reasons. One reason was that it violated the provisions of the Japanese. It killed, nobody knows how many exactly, because some people just disappeared in the blast, and their family members who might have remembered them also disappeared in the blast. Some people just left shadows on the sidewalk, But a reasonable estimate is that probably a third of the population, which is about 100,000 people. And they were protected people. They were not only, they were men, women, and children. Not only, we always hear about women and children, but men also were protected if there were civilians. Also, it obliterated cultural images, and it's now a war crime to obliterate Kyoto, which has 23, I think, UN cultural cultural sites, would have been obliterated, and that's now a war crime. And it far exceeded what was needed to get the Japanese to surrender. And so I didn't think that at the time. In fact, I didn't even suspect it, until 1995 when there was a book written. I think it was the decision to use the atomic bomb, and and then it's the architecture of an American legend. I think it is. It was written by, and it was very well reviewed, but then later it was heavily disagreed with by another group of professors who wrote another book called it The Hoax of Revisionism. It was revised history. So at the time it was hard, but later when I started to look at the original documents, not what people wrote about them, because, there was one book I'd recommend to anybody. It was written by a Princeton professor, and I think it really explains the other two books. And it's a book called On Bullshit. And Bullshit, this person, it was a bestseller for a while. It's only about 60 pages. He said, it's not lying. He says to lie is to try to, it's not knowing what you're talking about. He says not bothering. He says that the worst offenders are pundits and politicians. He says, but when you think about it, college professors also are pundits with PhDs. So they can be very selective also. An incredible scientific feat. And and the talent that went into that and the dedication that went into it. And it has to be really admired. I'm sorry for what it accomplished. And some of the physicists who worked on it when the Trinity test was successful cried. And many of them disagreed. And they didn't want the bomb dropped on as it was. They wanted a test. And if you want me to, I'd be very happy to tell you why a test was rejected and how they could have had a test or not a test, I mean a demonstration in Japan without doing that. Do you want me to?
Yes, and also if you've ever had contact with people who worked on it.
Yeah, I did have contact with one of the. I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about why a demonstration, which was heavily supported by some of the physicists. The physicist I talked to was a Nobel Prize winner. His name is Felix Bloch, and Felix was a physics professor at Stanford, and he was a very good friend of a professor who was a good friend of mine, Daniel Mendelowitz. And Dan used to have, at dinner parties, he would often have Felix and his wife, and he also would have me and my wife. We remained friends long after I graduated for the rest of Dan's wife. And so I knew Felix. I certainly was not considered, I couldn't even consider myself a friend of his, but an acquaintance, and he knew me. And one time I went skiing at Badger Pass in the Sierra, and Felix was there, and he asked me to join him. So I was flattered, and I started to ski toward the lift, and he says, no, he's Swiss, or was Swiss. And he says, no, he says, we climb. And I thought, oh. But I thought, it isn't every day that a Nobel Prize winner asks you to ski with him. So I put on skins, and we went up the hill, and as we were going up, I took the opportunity then to ask him about the Manhattan Project. And I didn't ask him so bluntly as, what do you think? But I just, and all he would say is, if we hadn't invented it, he says somebody else would have, and he cut it off. He didn't really want to discuss it from that point. So, and I think that reflects probably what a lot of, they've written about it since. And there was one who's very critical of the decision, who's Leo Szilard, who was a Hungarian Jewish physicist who came as a refugee. And he was the one actually who, before he came to the United States, he was a refugee in London, and he said he was walking across the street, this was 1933, and he had a thought as a way you could have a nuclear fission and a chain reaction. And that was all. It was just a theory in his head. And he was right. And at that point, so it was Manhattan Project was incredible. I mean, to go on from that in 1933 to what they did. I'm not sure, some people, I'm not sure Felix was right that we were developed anyway, because what it took, I don't know that anybody would have, because what it took is $2 billion, which is an equivalent of $28 billion now, which I think half the budget of the State Department. You'd have to have that kind of an allocation, so you'd really have to be motivated to do that. And I don't know that you'd be motivated unless there were a war. And the reason that the Soviet Union was motivated is because they knew we were developing one. So that motivated them. And they knew for a very interesting reason. There was a physicist who noticed that in the scientific journals that nobody in the United States was writing about atomic energy anymore, or the possibility of how you might have a chain reaction. And he thought, well, they're not writing about it. He says, because they're probably trying to do it. And he was said to have informed. Now, this is all hearsay I'm telling you, but the conclusion, the result is probably true. He says, so he informed Stalin, and then he initiated his own program. And General Groves thought, the committee, all of the people who were responsible for recommending and picking a site and so forth, were all informed by Oppenheimer. He says, the knowledge to do this is very well known. It's not developed, but people all over the world know this, so other people will develop them. And General Groves thought, well, nobody will have one for at least 20 years, so they thought we would have a lead. Well, the Russians had one in 4.
You returned to Hiroshima as a guest speaker for the Hiroshima Peace Foundation. What was that experience like for you?
Well, it was a complete... the first impression I had of the atomic bomb, of course, was in 1945. And I didn't really quite realize then that it had been a game changer in the sense that for strategic bombing, that the other bombing that has had a lot of attention was the Battle of Blitz, the Blitz in London. And the Blitz took about 6 months with hundreds of raids and thousands of sorties, and 40,000 people were killed. But not a lot of London was destroyed. But 40,000 people is a lot of people, but it's only 0.5% of the population of 8 million. In Hiroshima, it took, I thought it was a nanosecond, but it doesn't with atomic bombs. It was a second with one bomb and one plane, and it obliterated 2/3 of the buildings, and it killed 1/3 of the population. So that's a very different order. And it's debatable about whether or not the Japanese would have surrendered. They would have surrendered anyway, and there are other ways to have made them surrender. And I think that they might very well have surrendered after a demonstration. And so the first impression I had was that it saved my life and it ended the war. And that was about the end of it, and nobody really wanted to think much about it at that point. And also, killing people was the norm then. The second time I had an impression is that maybe they had dropped it to get Japan to surrender, but for another reason. That was from the book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb by Garl Perowitz, who was a professor at University of Maryland. It's a book of about 800 pages, and it's very dense and hard to get through, but the point is easy to get, and that is that the bomb was dropped because, as a diplomatic tool to try to impress the Soviets that we had this new power. Well, it was dropped for that reason, but it was dropped for other reasons. It was dropped for, one, to try to get Japan to surrender, two, to try to impress Stalin with this new tool, but he already knew we had it, and was developing his own, so that was really an idle reason. But it is true. The Secretary of State, Burns, who was in the book, is called Machiavelli, and he was, certainly. Third reason is vengeance, certainly. And I say that because Truman demonstrated when he said in his speech 16 hours after the bomb was dropped, he said that the Japanese, bombed Pearl Harbor, and now they've been repaid many-fold. Well, that sounds like vengeance to me. The third was bigotry. I mean, there was no love lost there wasn't much love lost on the Germans, but it was nothing like it was. The Yellow Peril was a menace for a long time. I was spared that kind of prejudice fortunately, because I went to high school with Japanese kids in Central California, where their fathers all had truck farms around town. And they were very well, they were just like everybody else here. And one was killed at a school accident, and Girls were weeping at his memorial in the auditorium and so on. Also, I served with Japanese Americans, and I lived with a Japanese family. So I had a different. Now, other friends of mine who didn't, one was a gunnery officer, and another was on an ammunition ship, and they held grudges against the Japanese. Well, bigotry was certainly one. And General DeWitt, the commander of the Western Command, said, "Once a Jap, always a Jap. It doesn't matter whether he's an American citizen or not, you know." And then they interned, over 100,000 of them. So I was spared that. So that was another reason. A third was that we spent $2 billion, and that $2 billion had to be justified. So there were a number of reasons why the bomb was dropped. Well, then, but the book was an eye-opener. It doesn't really prove that the Japanese would have surrendered before November 1st, but there's circumstantial evidence that they might have, but it doesn't prove it. Then that revisionist theory was severely debated later with it. By 2005, there was another book called The Hoax of Revisionism. So it wasn't in 2009 that I came to Hiroshima and began to see, if you go to the Peace Museum, there are exhibits that are shown in this book, which they gave me after my talk. We can't see this on camera, but this is the book that, well, if you go to the here it is. You go to the Hiroshima Peace Museum, and you'll see exhibits which are in this book. And one, for example, is a tricycle. I won't hold it up. It's a tricycle which looks as though it's been through a severe fire. And it was being ridden by a little boy named Unichi. And Unichi was just short of 4 years old. And he didn't die of the blast immediately, but he died that afternoon. And his father just thought it was too cruel to bury his son at a distant cemetery, so he buried him with his tricycle in the backyard. And then some years later, it was dug up, and the little boy's his bones were given a proper burial. But you see that tricycle, and I saw tricycles like that in Tokyo also. And then there are pictures here of women who had the patterns of their kimono left on their skins. And there's another one. This is probably the most famous of the little girls. Her name is Sadako. And Sadako was 2 when the bomb dropped, and she got a severe case of radiation sickness. Didn't leave her disfigured in anywhere. And she was in and out of the hospital for 10 years until she was 12. And then she went to the hospital for the last time. And there's a legend that if you build origami or paper cranes, it means ori is fold and gami means paper. So it's an art form that's pretty well known now. And she heard that if you build 1,000 paper cranes, then you would get your wish, which her wish was to go on living. And she got up to 600 and something, and then she died. And so her classmates, it's hard to even tell the story, and did the other 4. Well, there's a statue of hers in the Peace Park, and she's holding up, but it's bronze, and she's holding up a paper crane. And people from all over the world say there's a child's book about her, and she said, you can Google her on YouTube. When you see those things, you see that in the Peace Park, where there are other memorials, and you see that tricycle, and it really changes your mind. And there was a book written during the Cold War called The Unthinkable, Thinking About the Unthinkable by Herman Kahn. And he was a thinker in a think tank at RAND. And he was given the chance, and the Pentagon gave him a contract to think about winning an atomic war. Well, I thought after all of this that thinking the unthinkable was waging an atomic war, but it was thought thinkable by the Secretary of War. It was thought thinkable by all of these people who are really not bad people. And war does this. I mean, they were graduates of Ivy League schools. I mean, they're not evil men, but they thought it was thinkable, and they dropped one, and they rationalized it. And so that motivated me to think, well, not what people have written about the record, but what is the record? And fortunately now you can see it. It's been declassified. You go to Google, to the Truman Library, and you can take down these documents. Like, let's see, oh, yeah, there you go. Well, here's one labeled, this is the original document. I mean, it's a copy of the original document. It says Target Committee, Los Alamos, May 10th, 11th. And with the decisions and the discussions of the Target Committee and all the things they had to think about dropping the bomb. And then they talk about the potential targets. And one target that they list is Kildare, which is an important cultural center. And I mentioned with the 20 some odd World Heritage sites, and it's an intellectual center with universities. And their rationale was that since it's an intellectual center, the people there will better appreciate the significance. And this is verbatim in this thing. They better appreciate the significance of an atomic bomb. Well, those who are left, maybe. Well, fortunately, the Secretary of War Stimson had been to Hiroshima on his honeymoon, and he had it taken off the list because he knew what it was, and he thought it would be very bad PR for us in the occupation to have obliterated Kyoto. And General Groves General Groves, incidentally, in his long memorandum to the Secretary of War, describing the Trinity test, and I think if you've seen the Trinity test as it was described in that long memorandum, you'd think, well, this isn't a weapon of war, this is a natural disaster, but it didn't apparently occur to anybody that way at that time. And war does funny things. And so Stimson had it taken off the list, and Groves kept putting it back on, and finally Stimson took it off and it stayed off. But if Stimson's family hadn't had the money to send him to Kyoto on his honeymoon, he went to Niagara Falls, Kyoto would have been on that list. And then Hiroshima was on because it was still a kind of, quote, a virgin city. It hadn't been obliterated yet, and they were running out of these cities. And they thought it was well suited. It was about the right size. It do a lot of damage. And in his memo, General Groves had said, but we all know what's before us, that the real test is in the war with Japan, the battle test. So he wanted to see the bomb tested. Now, it's been argued that, they really wanted to drop a bomb to see what it would do. Now, there's no evidence of that anybody really thought that if Japan had, that they wanted to drop it before Japan surrendered to see if it would make them surrender. There's I find no documents. General Groves is pretty convincing that he wanted to see it dropped as a battle test, but not anybody else. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that certainly was the case. When you read the actual documents, the important dates are in November of 1944. It's the last 6 months of the war that really count. And they didn't have an atomic bomb and wouldn't have one for 6 months, but they felt they probably would have. So they formed the 509th Composite Air Group. It was trained at a secret field, and they had to reconfigure atomic bombs in order to be able to carry them. They enlarged the bomb bay, and they had got rid of the side guns and so forth. By that time, there wasn't much air cover in Japan, and so there's a pretty good chance they'd get through perfectly okay. Then the next important date was in May, when the Target Committee then decides on the list, and they had to think about the altitude and whether or not the plane. They thought there was a chance the plane might not be able to get away from the blast. Anyway, a number of things that they had to consider, and then a list of the cities to consider for bombing. And the next important date is June 1st, when there's a committee called the Interim Committee, and it's a secret committee. It's called interim because it was to make recommendations on what to do with atomic energy and but mostly it was to decide what to do with the atomic bomb. And they recommended to the president that they drop the bomb on Japan as soon as possible, without warning, and drop it over some kind of a war plant surrounded by workers' housing. So they had in mind, they didn't know really quite what the bomb would do. The Secretary of War thought that maybe it would end the war, that they thought of it as a psychological weapon also, that it could be a war ender. We still don't know I think it'll be a war ender along with everything and everybody else if they start to exchange a few thousand of them, Then the other book, and these are for sale in the Hiroshima Peace Museum, and I think that every world leader and every member of the Armed Forces Committees on both houses should go there. And this one is 2,000 drawings that were done by people who were in Hiroshima, who were some were victims, some were not. They're beautiful drawings. They're on display in the auditorium of the Peace Museum, and I thought they were folk art done by professional artists, but folk art. They aren't. They were done by people who lived in Hiroshima. The Japanese have a great sense of design. I think it's from drawing calligraphy, and but at any rate, they did, and they're beautiful drawings, along with little things that they have said about them and what they saw. Well, these things are all pretty hard to take. You'd have to be pretty insensitive to not make you want to curious to see, well, how did these people who were really not bad people think this unthinkable? Oh, I should tell you about the Potsdam Declaration. That's really an important part of the record. It was broadcast on September 26th. Not September, I mean on July 26th, the day after the order dropped the bomb, giving the Japanese an opportunity to surrender and what the conditions of surrender would be. And President Roosevelt at the Cairo conference in 1942 had said that we would accept nothing but a, quote, unconditional surrender. Well, from banzai charges and so forth, and people knew about the Bushido Code, where you're supposed to leave the battlefield with the head of your emperor without your own. And it does say in a little booklet that's given to every soldier not to endure the shame of surrender, that the Japanese would never surrender unconditionally. They had reason to believe that, but it wasn't true. In fact, there was the American Experience broadcast on PBS in which they said there was no word for surrender in Japanese. Well, there are 24 words for surrender in Japanese, and there's even a word for unconditional surrender. And unsurrender was not unheard of at all. And it's as a matter of fact, there are times like General McAuliffe, a U.S. general, his response to an offer to surrender was nuts, and so that lots of times people don't surrender. But at any rate, the Japanese would surrender, but it was anathema to them. They would not surrender if the word unconditional were used. In the Potsdam Declaration, they said, it started out pretty innocuously. It said, we're offering this opportunity to surrender. And there were a number of carrots. It wasn't an unconditional surrender by any means. They said, we don't intend to enslave the Japanese people. It won't be split into zones like Germany had been. And so the Japanese knew that. So it wouldn't be destroyed as a nation. It would be able to have access to raw materials and also to rebuild its industrial base, but not its war industry base. So those are all pretty generous terms, And prisoners would be allowed to return and live peaceful lives, whereas the Soviets, when they took prisoners, they put them in the gulag, So but there are also some sticks, and one which didn't have to be included at all. One of the sticks was people are going to be tried as war criminals, but they didn't have to put that in, and that didn't motivate. The actual decisions by both sides were made by very few people. In Japan, it was made by not by the emperor, although people in this country thought it was. He didn't have the power to make the decision to surrender. The surrender would be recommended, and it would be the controlling decision by the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. It was 2 admirals, 2 generals, and 2 civilians, the prime minister and the foreign minister. And they didn't, that wouldn't motivate them to want to surrender if you said they were going to be tried as war criminals and hanged. But it was in there. And the other thing that was in there was that, it said, it wasn't a negotiation. It said, these are our final terms. We will not deviate, and we'll brook no delay. Well, what they didn't know is that the Japanese couldn't surrender immediately because first there would be the recommendation to surrender by this Supreme Council. The Supreme Council, when they saw this Potsdam Declaration, which instead of being offered through a neutral country was broadcast, so they had to respond immediately because everybody in Japan knew about it. So it was... they were split 3-3, and they would make a recommendation to the cabinet of 19 people, and to surrender took a unanimous decision of the cabinet. You don't get 19 bureaucrats to agree on anything without delay, and they could never agree because the Supreme Council couldn't agree. What the Supreme Council wanted to do was to delay because they had asked the Soviet Union to be a mediator for negotiating a surrender. And of course, they didn't know the Soviets had already made a commitment to enter the war against them 3 months after Germany surrendered. So they naively were the foreign minister we have access to all of these wires, all the communication between him and the ambassador of the Soviet Union, who was saying, they're not going to mediate for us. And they said, well, you've got to try. So they hadn't had a response which they were satisfied with. And they said, well, let's just think it over or delay until we hear from the Soviet Union. And then because they were pressed, because it was a broadcast, they communicated with a press conference. These things are hard to believe, And the press conference, the prime minister, who was an old man, hard of hearing, and fell asleep during meetings, according to one source. I've never seen. It was the term mokusatsu. We will mokusatsu it. And mokusatsu in Japan, just two characters, it just means silent and kill. But in that it doesn't mean, but it has, like Japanese, that's what I was going to mention. Japanese it's very difficult to interpret it. And sometimes it took me a long time to learn that you hear something that makes no sense at all if it's interpreted word for word, but you get a sense of what it means, and then you say it in English, And you could say it a lot of different ways, but you could still say the same meaning. And the Japanese dictionaries are not dictionaries, but thesauruses. For example, if you look up the word hair, it'll say ke, and then as a definition, but not quite a definition, but it's like a thesaurus, equivalent words, more or less. It'll say hair or fur. So if you didn't really know the language and you just refer to it, you might say she has lovely blonde fur, So it's pretty easy to make a fool of yourself when you're translating Japanese. And mokusatsu has a number of meanings. One meaning is we reject with silent contempt. But another meaning is we are waiting in silent in meditation, in reflective thought, or something like that. That was what the prime minister is said to have intended to have said, but it was interpreted as we reject with silent contempt. And Truman had a very short temper. It was a wrong response to have gotten. So that's when he made the decision then they went ahead with the decision to drop the bomb. Well.
So, Al, is there anything that I have not asked you that I should have asked you in the course of the interview? Reflections, your experiences?
Well, there are about 100 organizations, I think, to try to either to eliminate atomic bombs. And it isn't enough to proliferation or lack of proliferation. The curious thing to me is that they're clearly designated as weapons of mass destruction, along with chemicals and germ warfare. But there are no treaties against it in one place. I don't know why. And that one treaty is over Antarctica. There are about 50 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, and everybody in the atomic club, I think. So Antarctica, the penguins are safe, and there are places. So why it hasn't been, designated a weapon of mass destruction with treaties against its use, but now, the cat's out of the bag. I don't know if anything could be done about that. And I guess that's the end of the sermon.